Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Liu from EU Public Diplomacy and Outreach, Vietnam. Welcome you all to the public lecture, The Evolution of Multi-Level Constitutionalism and Parliamentarism in the EU. Now, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Jorg Menzel from Germany, our speaker today. And Mr. Wan-Ho Amagro, political advisor from the EU Delegation. Mr. Wan-Ho now will give us the opening remark.
Thank you very much for coming today. We're very happy to have a distinguished speaker, Professor Menzel. We were lucky to lure him from Germany to Hanoi. And this takes place in one more of our public lecture series that we started this year, and will be also continuing over the month of May. I will give more information on that at the end of the lecture. But, let me introduce first Professor Menzel. He's a distinguished scholar. He's currently a researcher at the University of Bonn. He's been in a number of universities in Germany before, and he frequently consults in the region. He's been quite active in Cambodia, in Vietnam and Thailand, and I think we were quite lucky that CAST was able to hook him also to give us the lecture today. His field of research is mainly on administrative of constitutional law, and we thought that this could be a very good match with the current events in Vietnam, taking into account the new constitution that was approved late this year, and also the upcoming European elections. As you know, every 5 years, the EU citizens, they get to choose their own European Parliament, and so we're having that elections in the month of May over 4 days, because it will take place at a different time for each country, from 22nd to the 25th of May. This is the first time also that we have the elections after the approval of the new treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, and there are some interesting elements there. The guest professor will go a little bit more in depth afterwards. I would say that what's interesting, and we will see that during the lecture, is that the European Parliament has gained power as a co-legislator inside the European Union, and we have yet to see what that will bring in concrete terms over the next 5 years. I would also like to thank you all again for coming here. We will have about an hour presentation by a professor, and then we'll open the floor, and I encourage you to be a challenging audience for professor, and take advantage of his presence here to get as much as possible from him. Thank you very much, and professors, come in there.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here to this wonderful seminar, roof towering over Hanoi. I'm really glad I can be here for a discussion and some exchange of ideas. I will not have a kind of prepared speech, but will just talk through some topics I think are interesting and which we discuss a lot about in Europe, and in particularly also in Germany. At the moment, some developments over the last 50, 60 years or 70 years just a short comparison probably to the ASEAN situation and development. As was said in the introduction, I've been working quite a long time in Cambodia. I've been also occasionally in Vietnam, but only always for short visits, so I'm not really with any expertise on Vietnam. Yeah, I hope to learn every time I come here a little bit more. Yeah, the topic that we will discuss today, this issue of multi-level constitutionalism, is a phrase which is much discussed recently in Europe, because obviously there's more aspects to this than only the European dimension, but obviously in Europe it's particularly obvious that we have a situation where this term can be used and phrased with structures, political structure, institutional structures on various levels. So I would like to address the topic probably in 4 steps. First, I would discuss a little bit the question, what is multicultural, multi-level constitutionalism? Then the question, then ask the question, is there regional constitutionalization in Europe? Afterwards, I would like to discuss a little bit about the tensions between national and regional constitutionalism. I apologize that I would do that mainly from the German experience and from the German perspective, because for a short discussion here it would be too much to try to take into account developments in all 28 member states on this issue. Second reason, which makes it, I think, justifiable, is that in Germany we have a particularly intense discussion on this question with the decisions by the Constitutional Court, which is also very much getting attention in other countries in this field. Last but not least, a few remarks probably to ASEAN, but I will be very careful on that because maybe some of you are much better experts than me. As I was thinking that many of you may not be really from the legal field and maybe not used so much to all this terminology thing, I would like to start a little bit with a question, with some basic questions as an introduction. So first of all, the question probably, what is a constitution anyway? I edited a book a couple of years ago about constitutionalism in Southeast Asia, and in the foreword I put a proverb from Russia where in the 19th century somebody said every country has a constitution. Ours is absolutism moderated by occasional assassinations. So that was what one person characterized the Russian constitution of the 19th century. So when we speak about constitutions today, we mostly obviously have in mind a document, mostly a single text of a law, which has a supremacy as the law in that national context. So first of all, the constitution is a term which since the late 18th century is mostly used in the context of nation-state building and nation-states. That is the tradition since then. This tradition of having a written document, which probably even has then this supremacy within the legal system, is also quite a new development. As you might know, the first constitutions of that kind were basically made in the new places in the United States. First on the state level, and then afterwards on the federal level. So it's a development basically not more than 250 years old. Has this kind of written document. In some countries it's not only one document, but there's some additional documents to this. There's basically, I think, only 2 countries left which by plan do not have a written constitution, which is Great Britain and New Zealand. All the other ones, as far as I know, who don't have a written constitution at the moment, maybe are just in a transition phase because one system collapsed and the new one is not ready yet. That once in a while obviously happens. So we are used mostly to have this one single document. So that is what we mostly talking about. We talk about constitution, what is the typical content. In the beginning it was mostly about political structures, political institutions, balancing of powers and restriction of political powers. That is the original purpose. And many of the earlier constitutions, they were reduced to this. The American Constitution, in its very outset, had hardly any rights, for example. That came only later with the First Amendments. And also in Europe, for example, in Germany, the Constitution of 1871, which made Germany a unified country again, also didn't have any constitutional rights, individual rights for people. Today, constitutions are typically a little bit bigger and more comprehensive. They have this kind of political system, they have basic rights, and often they have a lot of decisions on policies and so on as well. So the Vietnamese constitution, I think, is an example for this approach, to have these kind of more or less three areas of topics covered. So what brings us from constitution to constitutionalism? I think that might be on this national level. You might be able to have a long discussion on that, because there's not a complete agreement what constitutionalism actually means. I have a more or less simple approach, just saying you have constitutionalism when you take your constitution serious. And when you really not only have it as a document, which is nice on paper, which is beautiful to read, but otherwise belongs into the section of poetry within your library. So a constitutionalist constitution, in Germany we would say the verfassungsstaatliche Verfassung, that would be a constitution which really is the supreme law of the country and is taken serious by politics and also by the legal system, and it's not just being a kind of a symbolic act. In earlier times there was a lot of constitutions which were characterized really as symbolic, because they were more or less just for the outside world or for some kind of propaganda purposes. The Khmer Rouge, for example, in Cambodia, they enacted a constitution in 1976, and nobody even knew about that in Cambodia, about this constitution. It was basically only a symbolic act to show to some outside countries that they somehow have a kind of system of statehood in place. So constitutionalism would mean you follow constitutional standards in our Western understanding from Europe that contains restriction of political power, separation of political power, mostly nowadays democracy, although you can discuss if democracy is really a necessary element of constitutionalism, and then also you can discuss what democracy actually means and how this has to be defined. And also today, as a standard, basic rights to be provided, which is followed now by most of the constitution, at least by nearly all constitutions which are newly enacted today. We still have constitutions like the Australian one, for example, which is from 1900, which doesn't have explicit catalogue of human rights. But today you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that anymore. And if you would try to do that, you would be criticized by your population typically quite heavily. Maybe some exceptions may exist. You should never say never, obviously, as a lawyer. So that's basically my introduction. What is constitutionalism and what is constitutions? The question now arises, obviously, when we speak about multi-level constitutionalism. I think the starting point is that from our traditional understanding of the term, the use of the word constitution was mostly restricted and mostly attached to the modern nation state. So it's the state, the nation state, who has a constitution, and that would be then only one level, so about 200 constitutions in the world, one for each country. However, from the very beginning, we had a kind of a multi-level, or at least double level of constitutionalism in some countries. For example, in the United States, we have from the very outset constitutions on the state level and on the national level. So the Constitution of the United States from 1787 sits beside the Constitution of Florida, of New York, of Massachusetts, nowadays also of California and Hawaii and so on. So that is a kind of a double constitutionalism already. The same we have in Germany. The German constitution, in Germany we have a federal constitution and we have state constitution. The same Switzerland, the same Austria, the same in Asia, Malaysia, which is the only formal federalism obviously in Southeast Asia. also with state and national constitutions. Basically I researched that a couple of years ago quite intensively, and I think the only federal state which doesn't have state constitutions is India, from the best of my knowledge, because in India the essence of how the states should be structured is already provided by the national constitution as well. But that's the exception, not the rule. All the other federal states would have twice declared in our current discussion. Then we have now a development, I think, a kind of an inflation in the use of constitution and constitutionalism, also on the levels above the national state. And that is, for one aspect, for example, regional constitutional elements, which we have in Europe. I will speak about that a little bit longer later on. But we even have, the term is now sometimes also used for even global developments. For example, there is a group of international lawyers who would argue that the UN Charter, or at least parts of the UN Charter, have constitutionalist elements. So the ones who are a little bit familiar with international law would know that Chapter 7 of the UN Charter has kind of a strong regime where the Security Council, if it can agree on something, can also really impose strict regulation, which is binding for each and every country in the world. It can be binding even for non-members of the United Nations. Some would argue that this is a constitutionalist element because it's more than simply a treaty power in the way. So the term is sometimes used for that. Some would also argue that the WTO, where also I think Vietnam is a member, is a kind of a system which kind of has also constitutionalist elements for the world economy. I do think it's a little bit of a question of taste, how you use the term constitution. In Germany, we are not that much used to this, and many constitutional lawyers would be a little bit skeptical if that inflation of the use of the word is really reasonable. We should, however, see that in the international field, the term or the use of the term is often much more flexible and much less. There's much less concern about this kind of dogmatic aspect. So we should just keep in mind that we have to know what we are speaking about when we speak about constitutionalist tendencies in these kind of structures. I will not discuss more about these global or other regimes, but for now focus only on the question if there is a constitutionalist element in what has happened in Europe in recent times. So if we have a European constitutionalism developed. And I will, from the outset I should say, I will address two aspects on that. One is the European Union, which is probably the main focus here on our discussion. But I do think that an important and integral part of this development is also the human rights mechanism of the European Convention of Human Rights. I think that has a strong component to it, which can also contribute to this picture of a kind of a constitutionalist regional structure. So, in Europe, I just would like to give a short overview on the development. Many of you here probably know these details much better, even better than I do, because I'm even not doing European law every day, but only sometimes in my work. So if I look back for the European Union, I think it is remarkable, and it's always important to keep in mind what has been achieved over the little bit more than last 60 years, since 1952, let's say like that. If you have a look at the, I have here the, I stole these pictures from an official presentation, slides which are provided on the website of the European Union. But I have to say it's not stolen because they clearly express that you are free to use it in your presentations. So it is kind of open access materials, and it's much more beautiful than I could do this. When the European Union, or when the first nucleus for the future European Union was born, it was basically this small association of a few Western European states in the European Community for steel and for coal and steel. The main purpose of that was quite economical. It had also to do with a little bit making sure that Germany is a little bit is not becoming too autonomous in that field again anymore. To make sure that we do not, after Second World War, become a little bit over the top again. But when it comes to military equipment and so on. So that was the nucleus. And then somehow the European development took off quite quickly in that sense, that a few years later with the Treaty of Rome, this is another of these pictures, of 1958, we have immediately already three treaties. One is this treaty on coal and steel. Then we have the Euratom, I don't know how to say that in English, Euratom, which is about nuclear energy use. And then, for the further development, probably most important, the European Economic Community, which is mainly probably the nucleus of what we call today the European Union. And that was in the beginning, as I said, it was a structure with 6 member states. And step by step it became bigger, and now it's 28, and no end still inside. Even maybe it will increase now a little bit slower in the near future. At least that's what I would suspect. So we have to see that this is a huge development from 6 to 28, and also from an organization which has a few topics to discuss, a very comprehensive regional organization covering basically all fields of life. Even they don't have concrete competencies in all fields, but basically they cover in their activities nearly all fields of life and somehow share policies with the national level in these fields. So we have made this way from Rome legal framework. And what is constitutional is probably what is a kind of a constitution-like structure in that already, without going into too much of the details, is that we have now these 2 main treaties, which could be called kind of the constitution of the European Union, and we have a legal system below that. And there is also this kind of structure of the supremacy of the treaty, of the 2 treaties. The one is the Treaty of the European Union, the other one of the functioning of the European Union. From the very beginning is a very legal thing. It is very much defined by legal structures, by legal procedures, by precise rules which have been under the supervision, protection, however you call it, of the European Court of Justice. And one big step in that sense was that the European Court of Justice was not shy to make itself known and to make itself important. Without that, there was a clear provision on that in the European treaty, in the treaties at the time. In 1964, in the famous decision of Constitutionalism, the European Court of Justice did something which can be said to be similar, like the famous decision of Marbury versus Madison in the United States of America, actually. Because the court simply claimed its final authority in supervising things, and especially it established a rule that from the special nature of the European community, it follows that it is not a normal international treaty, but it is a specific special treaty, which in particular guarantees the supremacy of European law in comparison to national law. So from that moment, there was a kind of a higher level of European Union law, at least European Community law at that time, at least from the perspective of the European Court of Justice. And I think it is quite remarkable that the European Court of Justice was not really very much challenged on that. It was basically, and I think that still is quite surprising, because we had a kind of, the members were all old nation states, and that they simply accepted that principle at the outset is quite remarkable. But that gave space for the European community really to become a very strong legal entity, And we wouldn't, I think we wouldn't understand today's status without knowing about this background. So the European Union grew and became became to cover more topics and also increased in size. Today we are about 500 million people. I think it's not so different in population than the ASEAN region, but it's obviously much more member states. And obviously, if you have an increased relevance of such an institution, and increased powers of such an institution, you also need to modernize the structure, and you need to have some kind of, if you call it constitutionalization or not, I would at the moment think is not so important, but you need to develop structures which are adequate to this. And especially in our European understanding, there needs to be some separation of powers, there need to be control, there need to be some kind of supervision and democratic elements. How much can still be discussed, but something like that had to be developed. And that was developed step by step. The last step that we have until now is the Lisbon Treaty, which after a long development has again strengthened the European Parliament, so the role of the European Parliament. This increase of role of the European Parliament has been taking place over quite some time, making its participation in legislation stronger, making its relevance with respect to controlling and selecting the Commission stronger, and so on. So the Parliament was strengthened. I will come back to that in a minute in a little bit more detail. Another aspect, I think, which could be also be said is remarkable is EU citizenship. We now have something like what we call EU citizenship. It is clearly has a few provisions in the treaty, and in the beginning, people were, I think, especially constitutional lawyers, at least me, we were a little bit joking about that because it seemed to be very symbolic in the beginning. The rights which were provided by this European citizenship seemed not to be that strong, and especially the term citizenship seemed to be a little bit questionable because it kind of obviously makes this, it seems like it's something similar to state or to national citizenship, to state citizenship, which is obviously is not. Actually, you cannot even get this European citizenship as a separate right or status, because you can only get it via getting citizenship of one of the member states. You cannot even get say, I don't like to be a European citizen, I don't want it, because you have the status automatically if you are a national of Germany or England or any of the 28 states. So the rights are kind of sometimes symbolic, but it's also some real provisions. So we have, for example, the freedom to move, the freedom to stay in every European country, not unlimited, and you probably on the long time have to be able to support yourself, but there's a lot of freedom of movement which is also connected with this. For example, when we are far away and outside, I think one aspect is that European countries under this European citizenship and get protection there. These kind of rights. It's also access to documents, it's the right to be addressed in your own language. There's a couple of rights connected with that. I wouldn't go into much more detail. Other two revolutionary steps you all know about, obviously, is first of all the invention of Schengenland. I'm not sure if all of you know what Schengenland is. The term even is used in England, in English as far as I've learned. Schengenland you cannot find in that sense on a map. Schengen is a treaty which was made by most of the European membership countries, which allows free travel and the abolition of border controls all over Europe as far as countries are members of this treaty. So you can now go from Northern Europe until Greece without ever being stopped at a border and asked for your passport. There's only a few European countries which are not part of that system. England, for some reason, think the ocean is not enough to protect them. They also think it's important to keep border controls for certain aspects, and some other countries have also decided to do so. Otherwise, in most of the countries we have the Schengen system, and as a German, if I want to go to Poland now or to any other neighboring country, I can always do that without even have to carry my passport or any documentation required to show that. The other big invention was then obviously the euro. You have probably realized or heard that there's a lot of discussion about the euro recently because we had some kind of financial crisis, obviously in Europe, and so there's a lot of euro skeptics now running around. I should just remind for the moment that the euro is quite strong actually. It has become stronger in recent times in comparison to the US dollar. So it seems that maybe even that crisis can be overcome. At least I think so. Opinions obviously are very different by different people. Yeah, we have obviously. I think you can see that quite clearly, and obviously most of you knew that before. We have a very unique regional organization. We have obviously regional organizations now all over the world. We have plenty of them in the Americas and in the Caribbean. We have plenty of them in Africa, and East and South and Western Africa. So we have a lot of regional organizations. We have a few in South Asia, and probably for Asia, the most important one, ASEAN. But when it comes to the institutional details, it's quite obvious that the European Union is quite unique. I would mention another aspect which I find very important and which also I think is quite important for this question of I always tend to say multicultural, it's not multicultural, multi-level constitutionalism is the European Convention of Human Rights. It always needs to be emphasized. I think many of you know that the European Convention of Human Rights is a product of the European Council, which is a separate international organization. It has more members than the European Union. All member states of the European Union are a member of that, but they have 20 more. So even Russia and a lot of Eastern European countries are all in the European Council, whereas they are not in the European Union. So what is the specific thing on that? Is this European Convention on Human Rights. In the beginning, that was a treaty that you could access, but you did not need to access, even you were a member of the European Council. The rules were later on changed. Nowadays, it's compulsory. If you want to be in the European Council, you have to be a member of the European Convention of Human Rights, and you also have to submit to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. And that was developed step by step. The European Court also had a slow start. This European Court of Human Rights also had a slower start. It was first a commission procedure in the beginning, and the jurisdiction, as I said, was not compulsory. Now you have a very big court, and you have it compulsory for all the member states. And this court is now kind of drowning in its own success since years. So I think there are about 30,000 cases pending or something like that at the moment. They have a large output all over Europe, increasingly even in countries like Germany, which in the beginning kind of thought that they were hardly ever affected because we had our own constitutional court and we were thinking that we can solve all our problems at home without that many cases would come to the European Court of Human Rights. We have done better now, and I will come back to that. It was from the beginning quite much more important in countries which do not have constitutional review by a homegrown constitutional court. So in states like Great Britain, for example, which doesn't have that kind of system, the importance of the European Convention of Human Rights and its court has always been quite significant, and in many other countries it's too. As I said, 30,000 cases pending, as far as I know. I don't have the statistics exactly now in mind. And a huge influence now on all constitutional system, even also on the German one. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Yeah, that about the constitutionalization of Europe. I will not go into the institutions now of the European Union. I think who's interested on your side can make yourself a little bit aware of that. Later on in this EU presentation, they have three key players. Maybe because they want to personalize it, they just mentioned three: the Parliament, the European Council, and the Council. The European Council being the meeting of the heads of states and members, heads of government, and the European Commission as the kind of a hybrid between a governmental and an administrative body for the European Commission. Largely important also because it monitors very much the observance of European law and also the development of European law by preparing new legal acts and so on, and introducing them into the lawmaking process. So I think what is missing here with these key players is obviously the European Court of Justice, because that is definitely a key player in the European system, and if they had been comprehensive, they had spoken of 4 key players and not of 3. Maybe they don't do that because they don't want to put a picture of the president of the court, because the court always remains a little bit more anonymous from the people than the other institutions, but it would have been appropriate to mention that as well. So let's go for a moment only for the European Parliament. I don't want to go too much into details, but as we have now pending or upcoming the elections to the Parliament, maybe it's worth a short look. This is also remarkable. It's often still said that it's the only directly elected regional parliament in the world. This European Parliament, I think, as far as I know, is not actually precisely true anymore, because we have the Central American Parliament, which is for Central American area, also with a direct election procedure, but that parliament is much less filled with competency, so it's not that relevant and in its work as the European Parliament is. So in that perspective, on an overall balance, obviously it's the most important or most the strongest, if you want to say like that, parliament in regional parliament globally, as far as I see it. It should be mentioned that it also had a slow start. The European Parliament was not elected directly until 1979. It was a more or less pure advisory body with delegates which were sent by their home countries on an occasional basis, and didn't have much of a role. So step by step the role of Parliament was increased, and a large step obviously was the introduction of the direct elections since 1979. So since 35 years now we have these elections. And these parliamentarians, they represent obviously the European citizens. It's just also remarkable that we are still voting in the national states, in the member states, and that the electoral system is also not unified. So we have, each member state has its own electoral laws for the European Parliament, a fact which is much criticized actually by European lawyers, because obviously for a really good representation by the European Parliament, it would be better that there would be unified standards to select. At least many say that. I think one can live with this system as we have it, but at least many would argue it would be an improvement to do that. There was also a lot of discussion on that, but until now a compromise in that direction hasn't been made yet. After recent reforms from the next election now in May on, the members of the European Parliament, also maybe the last word on that, is what is also remarkable is that the right to vote in this election is not depending on that you vote in Germany, for example, in my home state, for a German candidate, but it's only it's about residence. So a French person who is living in Germany, he will be able to vote in Germany on the German contingent, if you want to say like that, and the other way around as well. So a German who is living in France can vote there to the European Parliament. The members will be from the upcoming election up to 751. At the moment it's still a few more, but they reduced the size a little bit, so it will be 751. As I said, it's direct. First, I would always mention is parler, to talk. Parliaments have a right to talk. That's where the term is coming from, and that's what they do obviously in Europe as well, and in much more in much more languages than we do it in other parliaments. Then controlling and monitoring EU institutions, approving members of the Commission. That right has now also be strengthened. Participation in EU legislation, you spoke about that already. The role in legislation has much been increased in recent reform steps. It is still not entirely comparable to the role of a parliament, at least in Western European democracies, but it is much increased. Maybe the main driver in legislation is still often the Commission, even, which prepares a lot of legislation, but also then the crucial position is with with the Council, which has a much stronger position in the formal adoption of laws and of legislation than that would be the standard in national constitutions nowadays, typically. And participation in budget should also be mentioned. So the role is much increased, and therefore the Parliament might be more important than it has ever been before. Still, it has in the populations of Europe a little bit this reputation of being not that important, of being very far away. So somehow they fight a little bit still for full respect, which also you can see in typically in the participation at European elections, which is much lower typically than it is in national elections in most countries. So this is not from the European Union website. This is a cartoon I found somewhere in the internet. Showing the European Parliament. It seems to be a little bit satirical, with people making many different things, like sleeping, reading newspapers, talking to neighbors. Nobody's smoking, I think, but many more things. Anyway, that's how this cartoonist envisaged it. I think you could make the same picture also for the German National Parliament. All these activities are also quite popular in national parliaments, so one shouldn't be that critical on this. And even at least it's peaceful. I was tempted to show you also a photo of the Ukrainian parliament from recently, where there is a lot of heavyweight championship going on with boxing and any kind of fightings within the parliament rules. What is probably remarkable, I should mention, is if you watch this cartoon, on the top you see this translation boxes. This is really a remarkable thing, obviously, in the European Parliament, that they are working in 24 languages, that they have a huge translation service. And some of the criticism about the question, even by the German Constitutional Court, to say like that, to say it honestly, has been that democratic representation by Parliament and by the European institution cannot be that good as in the nation state because of these kind of mountains of languages which are spoken, which would make the discourse much more difficult than in countries which have only one language, or at least only, like Switzerland, 2 or 3. The European Parliament compensates this, or tries to work on this with a lot of translation services. Obviously there is no choice because we cannot agree on one common language. There have been attempts, at least on some levels, not necessarily in Parliament, but on some levels, to come to English as a standard language for conversation, but the French would never accept that. And as long as the French would not accept that, then the Germans would also say, if the French don't agree, we don't agree, and everybody else will insist also. So it will be remaining same, I think, for the near future or for the future to come. Representation in the Parliament, maybe final word on that, obviously is a little bit proportional. So bigger states have more members. Germany has the most, with I think in future 1996 I've read. The smallest one is, I think, countries like Malta, which has only 6. Still, the Maltesian, you say Maltesians? Maltesians? Anybody here from Malta? The Maltesians are much better represented per person of the population, actually, I think 100-fold than the Germans, because we have 80 million, more than 80 million people. Malta has only a few hundred thousand people. So these 6 members, each of them represents much less of the population of Malta than one member in Germany, obviously. Let me come to maybe the core of our topic, this question of multi-level constitutionalism, this question of how you deal with tensions or with the relationship between the European and the national level, because obviously we have this development in Europe to a kind of a constitution. Maybe one more word I forgot. If you remember back, this term constitutionalism, or if there would be a constitution, I should mention, that had played actually a role very much in the recent reform process in Europe. Because when in the early 2000s, the reform of the European Union was planned, there was actually a first in 2003. There was a concept of a European constitutional treaty. So the term constitutional was clearly used in the name of that treaty, and that was already agreed on by the member states. Why did it collapse, or why did it not become a law? Because this treaty had to go into referendum in a few countries, and in France and in the Netherlands the people rejected that treaty. And the common perception was that one of the reasons probably that the rejection took place is that indeed this kind of concept of constitutionalism and of a constitutional treaty would indicate too much more taking over of sovereignty or of powers at the European level. At least many people obviously, or some people used that argument. And in Germany we also had a discussion by many that the term would be inappropriate as a matter of principle for this development. It was more or less a symbolic thing. It didn't have much to do with the reality of the treaty. And even the treaty, how we have it now, is not much different in substance than the treaty that we had before. What is mainly taken away is this constitutionalist language. We don't have the term constitutionalist anymore, and some other modifications, but that's the main difference. We took out this kind of patina of using that term. I think at least that's an important point on that. So the term is kind of away for the moment. We are speaking again about a treaty. And if you still call it constitutionalist or not, maybe up to everybody's taste. In Germany, for example, there's just recently, in the second edition, is a large textbook been published by several authors on European constitutional law. They just use it as a book title now, and they discuss exactly these things, which would be discussed in a national constitutional law book, at least to a large extent as well. So let's go to Germany. And as you can imagine, in Germany the constitution doesn't go away just because something like that is also emerging on the European level. And so in Germany we have a strict constitution, kind of rigid concept of a constitution since 1949. A constitution which is designed to be very normative, that means very much to be followed in practice, with quite a strong constitutional court controlling the observance of the Constitution, a court which basically became much stronger than I think even the drafters of the Constitution had imagined at the time. In practice, the Constitutional Court, similar to the European Court of Justice, was quite clever in establishing its status in the 1950s already, and now is a really forceful power in German constitutional development, maybe one of the most courts of this kind around the globe. At the same time, the German constitution is also following this concept of international openness, so we try to have a constitution. There's provisions on that, but there's also a lot of interpretation which says that after Second World War, Germany is to be a good member of international and regional communities. So that's kind of a basic principle of our constitution, which finds expression in a couple of different provisions. So how did Germany then handle with, or does go along with this European development? First of all, also in Germany, the supremacy of EU law was generally accepted. As I said, it was accepted in all the member states and also in European, in German law. However, the Constitutional Court made a couple of very interesting decisions from the beginning, but also particularly in recent years. The so-called Solange decisions, that is called Solange, I said it this morning on another event as well. French people sometimes think it's Solange. It would be Solange decision because it looks a little bit like a French word. But it is German Solange, and that means as long as. And in the first decision, they basically said that they would reduce, that the German Constitutional Court would exercise its control over on the protection of basic rights, even in European law contexts, as long as the European community doesn't have a comparable standard of human rights, basic rights protection. It should be noted that in the European Union Treaty there was no catalogue of human rights or basic rights at the time. We only had these economic freedoms in the treaty, and we had the relevance of the European Convention, but not anything in the treaty itself. And then in the second decision, they kind of turned that argument around. In 1986, they said basically, oh, now we have a kind of a decent standard of human basic rights, and as long as it remains like that, we will not exercise our control, roughly speaking. That was these two decisions. More important, obviously, are more recent decisions, which had gone, I think, worldwide attention, got worldwide attention. First in 1993 on the Maastricht Treaty, and then in 2008 on the Lisbon Treaty. Both are kind of a little more or less in line. Even there's kind of some developments between it. I cannot go into all the details, but the German Constitutional Court had to decide on the constitutionality of Germany's accession to the Maastricht Treaty. If we could sign this reform treaty of Maastricht in 1993, and the court shocked a little bit the world by not rejecting the treaty. It accepted it, but it made a long reservation what can all not be done in the future and what had to be observed in the upcoming processes. And in particular, the German Constitutional Court at the time made a decision that said the European Union is not that democratic yet. So the institutions are not that democratic. The role of the parliament is not comparable to a national parliament. Also, they are not the conditions in Europe for real comprehensive democracy, particularly because it's not a kind of a homogeneous citizenship. It's different languages, it's barriers in communication. And a couple of other arguments they observe, and they said as long as that is not changing, it has to be made sure that real sovereignty remains on the level of the national state and is not kind of shifting over to the European level. So that made quite some, they got quite some attention for that under German constitutional lawyers and European lawyers. There's basically two fractions. The European lawyers often criticize the court very much for being prohibitive when it comes to future developments and European reforms. More traditionalist, conservative German constitutional lawyers sometimes were very happy that the court took the brave step to protect German statehood from being challenged by these European developments. So, in a sense, this discussion is still going on. With the Lisbon decision, the Constitutional Court now made an even new emphasis. They didn't say so much anymore that the European Union is not democratic enough yet. They even said now that by the concept of the German Constitution, they cannot even become fully democratically legitimized because that would destroy German statehood. And the German Constitution would not allow that the German statehood would be kind of shifted over to, or sovereignty would be shifted over to the European level. They said that even cannot be done by an amendment of our constitution, with the result that if we basically would have to make a new constitution for which we don't have even a real procedure in place in our constitution. So very problematic from my perspective decision. A lot of discussion of that ever since, but the Constitution, we have to say, the Constitutional Court, as it does always, it basically, it again accepted at the moment the Lisbon Treaty. So it didn't block anything. we had now the same procedure again with the European stability mechanisms and these activities in the financial crisis. Again, the Constitutional Court made a lot of warning words, what all cannot be happening in the future. But again, it basically didn't block. So there's even some joking nowadays that it's kind of a permanent strategy, always to try to shape the future, but for the moment, at least not blocking up-to-date developments. We will see how that goes on. We have just discussed before the presentation here now about this development in Germany. There's a lot of controversy of that, and many think that some of at least the arguments which were unfolded in that Lisbon decision are really something that the court should, on the next opportunity, take opportunity to rethink again. Maybe last but not least on this field, the relationship between the German constitutional protection of basic rights and the European Convention of Human Rights. I said before, in Germany that was in the beginning never that relevant. We were always from the beginning a member of that system, but hardly ever Germany was really, the European Court of Human Rights did condemn Germany for any violation. The reason, to a large extent, is that Germany has a quite a comprehensive system of protection. Everybody has the right to go to the German Constitutional Court with complaints of violations of basic rights, and you can only go to the European Court of Human Rights after you go to the Constitution of the German one. So there was not much left for the European Court to do in Germany. That's what I think, what at least many people in Germany took for granted after some time. In recent years, we have seen that the European Court of Human Rights has challenged some things in Germany quite explicitly. And obviously, even we have a quite well-developed system. Also in the German system, there are cases which are not really detected actually by that system, and where injustice remains, and where wrong decisions even will not be challenged by the Constitutional Court, maybe because they didn't have a precise enough look on a specific case, or maybe the lawyer who presented the case to the court didn't put the arguments properly enough, so that the court really got attention. So that happens once in a while. And after there was one decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which got a lot of attention in Germany, which was in the Caroline cases. I will not go into details now. There was quite an uprising of the government against that decision. And the German Constitutional Court then took an opportunity shortly afterwards in another case to clarify what they think is the role of this European Convention of Human Rights in the German system. And what they basically said is that we are a member of this European Convention of Human Rights, but they have only the status of law and not the status of the Constitution. And then say in the case of a concrete conflict between both, there would be a kind of a supremacy of the German constitutional values from that. The Constitutional Court clearly says it will always try to avoid that result by interpreting the German rights in a way that they are in harmony with also the European rights. And until now that also was always possible, so we don't have a real conflict situation yet. But they said, at least in theory, if a conflict is there, there is no kind of higher ranking of these European regulations. This decision as well was quite criticized by a lot of international lawyers and human rights lawyers, because it seemed in some of its formulations a little bit drunk on sovereignty aspects. What can discuss about that? As I said, until now, a real confrontation in a real case hasn't been happening as far as I see it. So until now, it's a more theoretical perspective. So you can see this multi-level constitutionalism is a fairly complicated thing, and in Germany it is one of the hottest topics in recent years. So there's hardly any other thing which gets so many publications, articles, books, and so on, and even, as you see, hard court cases. So it's something to observe. One thing that the Constitutional Court maybe finally also tried to make sure is that within this European process, European unification process, that there's also not the German Parliament losing too much power. Because obviously the situation is that when you shift powers to the European Union, the negotiations about that is often with the government. And Parliament is a little bit on the back seat all the time. So what the Constitutional Court has tried to make sure is to say that German separation of power has to be maintained. That means that there has to be a proper involvement of the German Parliament in those processes which are relevant in the European level. So these are some of these developments. Let me, for the final words, I think the hour is over. For some final words, a short move on ASEAN only, not with any details. I think it's quite obvious that ASEAN and the European Union are fairly different kinds of organizations. However, I've been on many conferences here in Southeast Asia, and basically every time there's an opportunity, people will discuss if there can be a comparison, if the European Union or some parts of the European Union can be a model, if there will be a development in the same direction in ASEAN, and so on. So it's obviously a topic interesting to discuss. What I would always say in the beginning is that with all criticism, and you heard that I am not completely convinced that all the developments in the European Union that we recently had are all that positive. So we have really relevant problems also. But what we should see is that, in a way, ASEAN, the European Union and ASEAN are huge success stories. We have since after Second World War in the area of the European Union not any single military conflict between states. And this is a region which for hundreds of years had been the place of a lot of wars. We alone had with France 3 wars within 100 years, or less than 100 years, from the mid of the 19th century. Wars had been all over Europe in the time of since 15th, 16th century and even before. So to have a peaceful area, or an area where at least conflict is not solved by weapons, is a huge success. And I think that is even true also for ASEAN. If I see ASEAN development, ASEAN is also a region with a lot of historical conflicts. If I remember the situation in the 1960s, for example, between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, that was not a region of eternal peace at the time. And also within the ASEAN member states, until now there has not been any, I put now in carefully large-scale military conflict, because you might all know that there's a little bit of a kind of a situation between Thailand and Cambodia in the area of the Temple of Preah Vihear. But this is comparatively small scale, and it's not an escalated military conflict. And maybe that is largely also thanks to that both of these countries are within the ASEAN context and some diplomacy takes place. But it's a delicate topic, particularly because it's often topics which are very much of interest for the public. So they go very much in the media, these decisions, and are very controversially discussed. Other topics, I think that the court decides sometimes also is simply the decisions are important and binding, but maybe sometimes even difficult to, that they have their full impact. Take Russia, for example. There is conviction over conviction against Russia, for example, with respect to prison conditions. Russia traditionally has very terrible prison conditions. That is clearly violating human rights standards under the European Charter, the European Convention of Human Rights. But Russia is not able or not willing, or at least not fast enough, in changing those situations. So even you have a lot of convictions, which may result in an individual right of a person to get some restitution or something like that, even that will not solve the general problem over the minutes. So there is obviously limits to that concept of protection, but we have to say it has a hugely educating effect on these 48 member states, be it from countries which have a well-established protection themselves, like Germany, to countries which have even much bigger problems in this field. I do think it's a huge civilizatory progress that we have with this system, and I'm very happy we are in that. And I'm always telling people also in Germany that we have to participate in that, just also to promote the general concept. Even if we think that our protection is quite good actually already, it is necessary to take part in this to help it to flourish. And also we have to acknowledge, even from Germany, sometimes come cases where you clearly see here the German system made mistakes, and it's sometimes good that you have this view from outside, where sometimes shows you your problem, and so that you can probably have an opportunity to fix it. The other question with the European Union, that is highly complicated at the moment with this human rights protection. As I said, the European Union itself didn't have a basic rights catalogue, but what we traditionally had from the beginning is this market freedom. So they have kind of a human rights dimension, but they are more or less economy centered and only for cross-border, initially at least for cross-border facts. So, but then the European Court of Justice, in the absence of provisions, they just developed them as customary law. They took them from having a look on the traditions of the different membership countries, and from that they also developed concepts for different kind of basic rights. That was the solution for many years. Then, now since recently, we have a European Charter added, a European Charter of Basic Rights. In the beginning, that was only a kind of a declaration, which was not thought to be binding, but now it is based immediately in Article 6 of the treaty, so it gets legal bindingness. And in addition, this Article 6 of the treaty also says that we feel obligated to follow the European Convention of Human Rights, and also that the European Union will also become a member of the European Convention of Human Rights. So we have we will have at that time a hugely complicated system with the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights and the national constitutional courts, and to kind of developing concept of interpretation of human rights. It's complicated, and it will even get more complicated as soon as the accession of the European Union to the European Convention of Human Rights really has happened. So that situation will nourish a lot of constitutional law experts and lawyers in the near future.
Yeah, so you can see there will be no shortage of work for those studying law here in Vietnam and in Europe, so you might be lucky there. Let me just give some quick closing remarks first. I would like to thank very much Professor Menzel for his presence here and his lecture. It was very interesting, so thank you very much. Second, I would like to also do some in-house advertisement. As you know, May is approaching, and May means Eurocity Europe Days. So we'll have a lot of activities around that, including the European Film Festival, some music concerts, some things. But we'll also have another 3 lectures here on our coming lecture series. And I encourage you also to attend. The first one will be on the 8th of May. We'll have Professor Blockmans talking about the European foreign policy after the May elections, how that would look like. On May 19th, we will have Professor Wiskop, who will look also at the European defense policy and what is the role of Europe also in Southeast Asia, another very interesting topic. And finally, at the end of May, 29th, we will have Andres Moore talking about the Ukrainian crisis and what has been the role of the different major powers. So that also links to your question before. Finally, I would just like to thank all of you for your patience and your attention today, and I hope to see you again very soon here at the public lectures of the EU Delegation. Thank you very much.